My name is Catherine Hilton, and at 29, I never expected to be sitting in a mahogany-paneled conference room watching my biological family plot to steal millions from their own mother's estate. As a tech entrepreneur who built a company from nothing, I thought I understood manipulation and betrayal in business. That was until I discovered my birth family and realized they saw my success not as something to celebrate, but as an opportunity to exploit. When I got that urgent text from my half-brother Vincent demanding an emergency family meeting, every instinct I'd developed as a CEO started screaming warnings. Walking into that meeting, I knew they had no idea what was coming. Before I continue with my story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and get ready for a wild ride about family, money, addiction, and the shocking lengths I went to protect what was rightfully ours. My story begins not with my biological family, but with the people who raised me. The Hiltons adopted me when I was 3 years old, after my birth mother Margaret proved unable to care for me due to what I later learned were severe addiction issues. Growing up, I always knew I was adopted. My parents, David and Susan Hilton, never hid this fact from me. They were wonderful, supportive parents who encouraged my entrepreneurial spirit from an early age. Even as a child, I was different from other kids. While they played house or video games, I was creating elaborate business plans for lemonade stands and organizing neighborhood car wash services. By age 12, I was tutoring other students for money and had saved enough to buy my first computer. By 16, I had taught myself to code and was freelancing web development projects. David worked as a mechanical engineer and Susan taught elementary school. They provided a stable, loving home, but they often worried about my workaholic tendencies. "Catherine, honey, you need to slow down and enjoy being young," my mom would say as I stayed up until midnight working on coding projects. But I couldn't help myself. Creating something from nothing, solving problems through technology, it all felt natural to me in a way that socializing and typical teenage activities never did. I graduated high school at 17 and went straight to college on a partial scholarship, working part-time to cover the rest. By my junior year, I had developed an app that helped small businesses manage their inventory and customer relationships. It wasn't revolutionary, but it solved real problems, and small business owners were willing to pay for it. By the time I graduated at 21, my app had grown into a small but profitable company. I moved to the city, hired my first employees, and threw myself completely into building my business. My parents were proud but concerned. They wanted me to find balance, maybe meet someone special, start a family of my own someday. For years, I had no interest in finding my biological family. The Hiltons were my real parents in every way that mattered. But when I turned 26, a routine visit to my doctor for some persistent health issues led to genetic testing. The results showed markers that didn't align with my known medical history, suggesting I might benefit from understanding my biological background for health purposes. That's when I decided to take one of those DNA ancestry tests, more for medical information than out of any burning desire to find my birth family. The results, when they came back 3 months later, were surprising. Not only did they reveal my ethnic background, but they also connected me with several potential relatives who had also taken the test. The closest match was someone named Eleanor Blackwood, showing up as a potential grandmother. There were also matches for what appeared to be half-siblings, Vincent, Sophia, and someone listed as Margaret who seemed to be the right age to be my birth mother. I stared at those names on my computer screen for hours, debating whether to reach out. Part of me was curious, but another part was terrified of disrupting the peaceful life I had built. Eventually, curiosity won. I decided to message Eleanor first, since she seemed like she might be the family matriarch. I crafted a careful, polite message explaining that we had matched as potential relatives and that I was adopted, wondering if there might be a family connection. Eleanor responded within hours, and her message took my breath away. She had been searching for me for over 20 years. She explained that her daughter Margaret had given birth to me when she was very young and struggling with addiction. The family had lost track of me after I was placed for adoption, despite Eleanor's attempts to maintain contact or gain custody herself. She had been using DNA services and hiring private investigators for years, hoping to find me. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe in the city. I was nervous as I walked in, scanning the room for an elderly woman who might look like family. When I spotted her, there was no question. Eleanor Blackwood was in her late 70s, impeccably dressed, with sharp, intelligent eyes that looked remarkably like my own. She stood when she saw me, tears immediately flowing down her cheeks. "Catherine," she whispered, reaching for my hands. "You look so much like your mother did at your age, before." She trailed off, but I understood. Over coffee that stretched into a 3-hour conversation, Eleanor told me about the family I had never known. My biological mother Margaret was her eldest daughter, now 55, who had struggled with gambling addiction for most of her adult life. My half-brother Vincent, 32, was a successful investment banker who seemed to have his life together on the surface. My half-sister Sophia, 27, was trying to make it as an actress while working various service jobs. Eleanor herself was a widow who had built considerable wealth through smart real estate investments and careful financial planning over the decades. She was clearly sharp, asking detailed questions about my business and seeming genuinely impressed by what I had accomplished on my own. "I always wondered what became of you," she said, her eyes bright with pride. "But I never imagined you would have achieved so much. You have a strength that skipped a generation in this family." That comment struck me as odd, but I didn't press for details. We arranged to meet again the following week, and she insisted on inviting me to a family dinner so I could meet everyone else. The family dinner was held at Eleanor's impressive home in an upscale neighborhood. The house was exactly what you'd expect from someone of her means, tastefully decorated, well-maintained, with an air of old money and established taste. Margaret was the first to greet me, and the resemblance was immediately apparent. She was still attractive, but there was something brittle about her, a nervous energy that kept her hands constantly moving. She hugged me tightly, crying and apologizing repeatedly for giving me up. "I was so young and so messed up," she kept saying. "I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I've regretted it every day since." Vincent arrived shortly after, and I was struck by how polished he appeared. Expensive suit, perfect hair, confident handshake. He worked for a prestigious investment firm and seemed genuinely pleased to meet me, asking intelligent questions about my business and offering connections that might help me expand. Sophia was the last to arrive, rushing in with the dramatic flair you might expect from an aspiring actress. She was beautiful and charming, immediately treating me like we had known each other our whole lives. The dinner itself was lovely. Eleanor had clearly gone all out, and the conversation flowed easily. They all seemed genuinely interested in my life, my business, my relationship with my adoptive parents. I found myself relaxing, thinking that maybe I had been worried about nothing. It wasn't until I had been visiting with the family for several months that I began to notice the patterns. Eleanor would often ask me to join her for coffee or lunch, just the two of us. During these conversations, she would share her concerns about the rest of the family. Margaret's gambling had gotten worse in recent years, and she frequently needed bailouts to cover her debts. Sophia was living far beyond her means, constantly asking for money for headshots, acting classes, and rent for an apartment she couldn't afford. Even Vincent, despite his successful career, seemed to have expensive tastes that outpaced his income. "I love them all dearly," Eleanor told me during one of our private conversations, "but I worry I've enabled their poor financial decisions for too many years. Every time I think one of them has learned their lesson, there's another crisis requiring my intervention." She began asking for my opinion on various financial decisions, clearly respecting my business background. When Margaret needed money for gambling debts, Eleanor asked me what I thought about providing it. When Sophia wanted funding for an expensive acting workshop in Los Angeles, Eleanor wondered if it was a worthwhile investment or just more enabling. I tried to be diplomatic, but honest. Based on what I observed, it seemed like the family had developed unhealthy patterns around money. Each bailout removed the natural consequences of poor decisions, making it more likely that the same problems would recur. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully at my assessments. "You have a wisdom about these matters that they lack," she said. "I'm beginning to think I need to make some changes to how I handle family finances." Meanwhile, my individual relationships with each family member continued to develop. Margaret would call me regularly, often when she was feeling emotional about our lost years together. During these calls, she would frequently mention her financial stress, how hard it was to make ends meet, how gambling was really more of a social activity that had unfortunately gotten out of hand. Vincent would take me to expensive restaurants, introducing me to his colleagues and treating me like a beloved sister he was proud to show off. During these dinners, he would often discuss investment opportunities, wondering if I might be interested in partnerships or if I knew other successful entrepreneurs who might want to invest in his firm's projects. Sophia was perhaps the most direct in her approaches. She would invite me to girls' days at expensive spas or shopping trips, then casually mention how challenging it was to make it in the entertainment industry without family support. She would talk about other actresses whose families had invested in their careers, making it clear that she viewed family financial support as normal and expected. I began to feel uncomfortable with these conversations, sensing that each family member was positioning themselves for some kind of financial request. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was too accustomed to thinking about relationships in business terms. Then Eleanor had a heart attack. It happened suddenly, during one of our regular coffee meetings. One moment we were discussing a real estate investment she was considering, and the next she was clutching her chest, struggling to breathe. I called 911 and rode with her to the hospital, calling the rest of the family from the ambulance. Eleanor survived, but her recovery was slow. During the weeks she spent in the hospital and then in rehabilitation, I found myself becoming more involved with the family's day-to-day concerns. Margaret was distraught, barely functional with worry about her mother. Vincent was trying to manage Eleanor's immediate financial affairs while she recovered. Sophia was convinced Eleanor might die and was having dramatic emotional breakdowns daily. It was during this crisis that Eleanor asked to speak with me privately. Her doctor had warned that while she would likely recover fully, the heart attack was a wake-up call about her mortality. "Catherine," she said, taking my hand with fingers that seemed more fragile than before, "I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I nodded, prepared for some kind of emotional conversation about our relationship or her health. "In the time you've been part of this family, what have you observed about how the others handle money and responsibility?" The directness of the question surprised me, but I had learned to trust Eleanor's wisdom. I told her honestly what I had seen: patterns of financial dependence, lack of natural consequences for poor decisions, and what seemed like a sense of entitlement to her financial support. Eleanor nodded grimly. "I was afraid you would confirm what I already suspected. Catherine, I've been thinking about my estate planning, and I need your help with something." She explained that her current will left her substantial assets divided among Margaret, Vincent, and Sophia, with smaller bequests to various charities and a modest amount set aside for me as the newly discovered family member. But she was concerned that dividing the money equally among her children and grandchildren would simply enable more of the same destructive patterns. "I want to establish a family trust," she said. "Something that will provide for everyone's genuine needs while encouraging better financial decision-making. But I need someone I trust to help structure it properly, someone who understands both business and this family's dynamics." She was asking me to help design the very system that would govern my family's financial future. Over the following months, as Eleanor recovered, we worked together with her estate attorney to create what we came to call the Blackwood Family Trust. The structure was complex, designed to address the specific issues we had identified in each family member's relationship with money. The trust would hold the majority of Eleanor's assets, approximately $2.3 million in investments, real estate, and savings. Rather than providing outright inheritance, the trust would make distributions based on specific criteria designed to encourage financial responsibility and personal growth. For Margaret, accessing trust funds would require completion of a gambling addiction program and ongoing counseling, with distributions structured to support her housing and basic needs while preventing large lump sums that might fuel gambling binges. For Vincent, despite his apparently successful career, we had learned through Eleanor's banker that he had a concerning pattern of high-risk investments and was facing potential SEC scrutiny for some questionable trading practices. His access to trust funds would require financial transparency and adherence to ethical investment practices. For Sophia, distributions would prioritize legitimate career development and education over lifestyle funding, with clear documentation required for any entertainment industry investments. The trust also included provisions for the next generation, ensuring that any future children or grandchildren would have access to education funding while learning healthy financial habits from an early age. Most importantly, Eleanor appointed me as the primary trustee, with the family attorney as co-trustee to provide professional oversight. This meant that I would have significant influence over how and when family members could access their inheritance. "Are you sure about this?" I asked Eleanor as we finalized the documents. "This puts me in a very difficult position with the rest of the family. They're going to see me as controlling their access to money they consider rightfully theirs." Eleanor's eyes were firm with resolve. "Catherine, you are the only person in this family who has demonstrated the ability to build wealth responsibly and maintain healthy boundaries around money. I trust you to make decisions that are truly in everyone's best interests, even when they can't see it themselves." The trust was established 6 months before Eleanor's death, allowing us to transfer assets while she was still alive and mentally competent. The family attorney documented everything carefully, ensuring that there could be no question about Eleanor's mental state or intentions. Eleanor passed away in her sleep 8 months after her heart attack, and while we were all grieved, we also knew she had lived a full life and died peacefully. The funeral was well attended, with many people sharing stories about Eleanor's generosity and wisdom over the years. The will reading took place a week after the funeral in the attorney's office. Margaret, Vincent, Sophia, and I sat around a conference table as Mr. Harrison, the estate attorney, explained the basic structure of what Eleanor had left behind. The house would be sold, with proceeds going to the trust. Various personal items were distributed according to Eleanor's wishes. There were small individual bequests to each family member, enough to cover immediate expenses but nothing life-changing. The bulk of the estate, Mr. Harrison explained, was held in the Blackwood Family Trust, which had been established before Eleanor's death and was already funded and operational. "Catherine will serve as the primary trustee," Mr. Harrison continued, "with my firm providing co-trustee services and professional oversight." I watched the faces around the table carefully. Margaret looked confused but not particularly concerned. Vincent's expression was unreadable, his banker's poker face firmly in place. Sophia frowned but seemed more puzzled than upset. "What exactly does that mean?" Margaret asked. "Catherine decides what we get from Mother's money." Mr. Harrison explained the basic structure. The trust was designed to provide for everyone's needs while encouraging financial responsibility. Distributions would be made based on specific criteria that had been carefully outlined in the trust documents. "It's more complicated than a simple inheritance," he admitted, but Mrs. Blackwood felt this structure would best serve the family's long-term interests. Vincent spoke up for the first time. "When can we see the complete trust documents? I'd like to understand the specific terms." "Of course," Mr. Harrison replied. "I'll provide copies to everyone." Catherine, as trustee, will also be scheduling individual meetings with each beneficiary to discuss the specific provisions that apply to their situations. As we left the attorney's office that day, the family's reaction was surprisingly mild. I think they assumed that as family, and as someone who genuinely cared about them, I would be generous with distributions. They didn't yet understand how seriously I took the responsibility Eleanor had given me, or how extensively we had documented their financial patterns. For the first few months after Eleanor's death, things proceeded relatively smoothly. The trust provided for everyone's basic needs: Margaret's rent and utilities, contributions toward Vincent's mortgage, assistance with Sophia's reasonable living expenses. I approved distributions for legitimate expenses without much scrutiny, giving everyone time to adjust to the new reality. But gradually, the requests began to escalate. Margaret was the first to test the boundaries. 6 months after Eleanor's death, she came to me with what she described as a small emergency. She had gotten behind on some bills and needed about $5,000 to get caught up. When I asked for documentation of the specific bills, she became evasive. "Catherine, honey, I'm your mother," she said, tears forming in her eyes. "Surely you don't need to see paperwork for everything. Can't you just trust me?" I explained gently that the trust required documentation for all distributions, and that this wasn't about trust but about fulfilling my legal obligations as trustee. When she finally provided the documentation, It revealed that the bills were actually gambling debts to several local casinos. I denied the distribution request but offered to pay for gambling addiction counseling, as outlined in the trust provisions. Margaret was furious. "You're not my daughter," she said angrily. "My real daughter would understand that I'm going through a difficult time and need support, not judgment." Vincent's test came a few months later. His investment firm was facing an SEC investigation into some questionable trades, and he needed $500,000 for legal fees and potential settlements. He approached me with a professional presentation, treating it like a business meeting. "This is exactly the kind of situation the trust should be designed to help with," he argued. "These are legitimate legal expenses related to my career." When I asked for more details about the SEC investigation, Vincent became defensive. "That's confidential information, Catherine. You're going to have to trust my judgment on this." I explained that the trust provisions specifically addressed ethical issues and that I couldn't approve large distributions for legal problems that might stem from questionable practices. Vincent's polished facade cracked. "You don't understand how the business world works," he said condescendingly. "These regulatory issues are just par for the course. Everyone deals with them." Sophia's approach was more emotional manipulation. She had been offered what she described as an incredible opportunity to work with a renowned acting coach, but it required moving to Los Angeles and paying $30,000 upfront for intensive training. "This could be my big break, Catherine," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Grandmother always said she wanted to support my dreams. How can you deny me this opportunity?" When I asked for more information about this acting coach and the program, Sophia couldn't provide verifiable details. My research revealed that the renowned coach was running what appeared to be a scam targeting aspiring actors. I offered to pay for legitimate acting classes locally and to help her research reputable programs in Los Angeles if she was serious about relocating. Sophia was outraged. "You're jealous," she accused me. "You never had to struggle for anything, with your perfect adoptive family and your successful business. You can't stand the idea that I might succeed too." Each of these confrontations was painful, but they confirmed that Eleanor's concerns had been justified. Without the structure of the trust, I likely would have given in to their requests, and the family's financial problems would have continued or worsened. But the individual approaches were just the beginning. As it became clear that I wasn't going to be the easy mark they had hoped for, the three of them began coordinating their efforts. It started with phone calls between them that I wasn't supposed to know about, discussions about how to handle the Catherine situation. I learned about these conversations through Eleanor's longtime housekeeper, Maria, who had continued working part-time to help manage Eleanor's estate affairs. Maria had grown fond of me and was concerned about some of the things she overheard when the family visited Eleanor's house while it was being prepared for sale. "They don't speak kindly of you when you're not around, Mija," Maria warned me. "They blame you for their grandmother's decision to set up the trust. They think you manipulated her." The coordinated campaign began subtly. Margaret would call me crying about how disappointed Eleanor would be to see the family fighting over money. Vincent would mention in casual conversation how unusual it was for someone so new to the family to have so much control over generational wealth. Sophia would make comments about how I seemed to have forgotten where I came from now that I was in a position of power. Then Vincent requested a formal family meeting. His text message was professional and urgent. "Catherine, we need to discuss some important family financial matters. Can we meet this Sunday at 2 p.m. at Eleanor's house? This is time-sensitive regarding the estate." The formality of the request and the location choice seemed designed to create psychological pressure. Eleanor's house, while still unsold, held emotional significance for all of us. Meeting there would remind me of Eleanor's memory while also placing me in a space where the other family members might feel they had more claim than I did. I agreed to the meeting but decided to take precautions. I contacted Mr. Harrison, the co-trustee attorney, and asked him to be available by phone during the meeting. I also brought a digital recorder, informing everyone at the start of the meeting that I would be recording our discussion for the trust records. The reaction to the recording device was immediate and telling. Margaret looked panicked, Vincent's jaw tightened, and Sophia demanded to know why recording was necessary. "It's standard practice for trustee meetings," I explained calmly. All trust business needs to be properly documented. The meeting began with Vincent taking the lead, his investment banker presentation skills in full display. He had prepared a folder of documents and spoke in measured, professional tones. "Catherine, we appreciate everything you're trying to do with the trust, but we think there may be some misunderstandings about grandmother's intentions." He opened the folder and began presenting what he claimed was evidence that Eleanor had intended for the trust to be more flexible, more generous in its distributions. The evidence consisted of old family photos, birthday cards where Eleanor had written messages about wanting everyone to be happy and successful, and copies of previous financial gifts she had made to family members. "Look at this pattern," Vincent argued, pointing to records of Eleanor's previous bailouts. "Grandmother always helped us when we needed it. The trust should continue that tradition, not create arbitrary barriers." Margaret jumped in with her emotional approach. "Catherine, honey, you didn't know your grandmother for as long as we did. She was never this rigid about money. She would want us to be able to access our inheritance when we need it." Sophia's contribution was more dramatic. "I've been thinking about this a lot, and I really believe grandmother would be heartbroken to see how the family is being torn apart by these trust restrictions." I listened carefully to their presentations, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. It was clear they had planned this approach together, each playing to their strengths: Vincent's business logic, Margaret's emotional manipulation, and Sophia's dramatic appeals. When they finished, I set down my pen and looked at each of them in turn. "I understand your concerns," I said calmly. "But I think you're misunderstanding both Eleanor's intentions and the current situation." I opened my own folder, containing documents they had never seen before. "Before we go any further, I want to make sure everyone understands exactly how this trust came to exist and what Eleanor's actual wishes were." I began with the recordings Eleanor and I had made during our trust planning sessions. Her voice, clear and determined, filled the room as she explained her concerns about each family member's financial habits. Margaret's face went white as she heard her mother's voice describing her gambling addiction and the pattern of lies that had accompanied previous bailouts. Vincent shifted uncomfortably as Eleanor's recorded voice detailed her concerns about his risky investments and potential legal troubles. Sophia began crying as she heard Eleanor express disappointment about her spending habits and lack of serious career planning. But the most damaging recording was one Eleanor had made privately, without my knowledge, and had given to Mr. Harrison to be played only if the family challenged the trust structure. In this recording, Eleanor spoke directly to her children and grandchildren. "If you are hearing this recording, it means that you are fighting Catherine about the trust, which means you have learned nothing from the lessons I tried to teach you during my lifetime. Catherine didn't manipulate me or steal your inheritance. I asked for her help because she was the only one in this family who showed the wisdom and integrity I hoped to pass on to all of you." The room was silent except for the sound of Sophia's quiet sobbing. "Catherine," Eleanor's voice continued, "if they are pressuring you to ignore the trust provisions, please remember that giving them what they want is not the same as giving them what they need. I trust you to make the hard decisions that will ultimately help them become better people." When the recording ended, I gave them a moment to process before continuing. "Now," I said, "let's talk about what's really happening here." I pulled out the evidence I had been gathering over the past year: documentation of Vincent's sex troubles, records of Margaret's continued gambling despite claiming to be in recovery, evidence of Sophia's involvement with what appeared to be drug use based on her social media posts and financial patterns. "Vincent," I said, looking directly at him, "your legal troubles aren't just regulatory disagreements. You've been using client funds for high-risk personal investments. The SEC investigation could result in criminal charges." Vincent's composed facade finally cracked. "How did you? You had no right to investigate my business affairs." "I have every right," I replied firmly. "As trustee, I'm legally obligated to ensure that trust funds aren't used to enable illegal activities." I turned to Margaret. "And Mother, you haven't attended a single gambling addiction meeting since Eleanor's death. In fact, you've been to 3 different casinos in the past month." Margaret's tears turned to anger. "You've been spying on me. What kind of daughter does that?" "The kind who cares more about your long-term well-being than your short-term comfort," I replied. Finally, I addressed Sophia. And Sophia, the acting coach you wanted $30,000 for? He's been arrested twice for fraud. But more importantly, half of your rent money for the past 6 months has actually been going to buy cocaine. Sophia jumped to her feet, her face flushed with rage. You have no idea what my life is like. You grew up in some perfect suburban family while I've had to struggle for everything. I grew up in a stable family because our biological mother was too addicted to care for me, I replied calmly. The difference is that I learned from that experience instead of repeating it. Vincent tried to regain control of the meeting. Catherine, even if everything you're saying is true, we're still family. Family helps each other through difficult times. You're absolutely right, I agreed. That's exactly what the trust is designed to do. Help you through difficult times by addressing the root causes of your problems instead of just throwing money at the symptoms. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Eleanor's carefully maintained garden. Here's what's going to happen, I said, turning back to face them. The trust stands exactly as Eleanor designed it. Margaret, if you want access to significant funds, you'll need to complete a legitimate addiction treatment program and maintain sobriety for at least 6 months. Margaret started to protest, but I continued. Vincent, you'll need to resolve your SEC issues through legal means and demonstrate a commitment to ethical business practices. The trust will pay for legitimate legal representation, but not for settlements related to criminal activity. Vincent's face was red with anger, but he remained silent. And Sophia, you can access funds for legitimate career development, including real acting classes, headshots, and reasonable living expenses while you build your career. But not for drugs, scam artists, or luxury lifestyle expenses. Sophia was crying again, but this time it seemed more from frustration than emotional manipulation. Furthermore, I continued, since all 3 of you have now demonstrated that you're willing to coordinate attempts to manipulate me and circumvent Eleanor's wishes, all future trust distributions will require additional documentation and oversight from Mr. Harrison's firm. Vincent finally exploded. This is insane. You've known this family for less than 4 years, and now you think you can control our entire financial future. I don't want to control your financial future, I replied calmly. I want to help you learn to control it yourselves. That's what Eleanor wanted too. Margaret stood up shakily. If you don't help us, Catherine, we'll have no choice but to take legal action. We can contest this trust. I had been expecting this threat. I pulled out one final document from my folder. You're certainly welcome to try, I said. But you should know that if you contest the trust and lose, this clause will take effect. I handed them copies of what Eleanor had called her nuclear option, a provision that would permanently exclude from any trust benefits anyone who unsuccessfully challenged the trust's validity. Eleanor was very clear about this, I explained. She was willing to help family members who struggled with financial responsibility, but not family members who tried to manipulate or steal from the family trust. The room fell silent as they read the document. The implication was clear: if they tried to break the trust and failed, they would lose access to Eleanor's money entirely. Vincent was the first to speak, his voice tight with controlled anger. You really think you've won, don't you? You've manipulated an old woman, stolen our inheritance, and now you're threatening to cut us off entirely if we don't dance to your tune. I think Eleanor won, I replied quietly. She created a system that will help her family learn financial responsibility while ensuring that her life's work isn't wasted on addiction and poor decisions. Margaret was shaking her head in disbelief. I gave birth to you. I'm your mother. How can you do this to me? The question hit me harder than I expected, but I had prepared for this moment. You gave birth to me, I agreed. But then you chose addiction over motherhood. The Hiltons chose to be my parents. Eleanor chose to trust me with this responsibility. And I'm choosing to honor that trust, even when it's difficult. Sophia, who had been quiet for several minutes, suddenly stood up and grabbed her purse. I'm done, she announced dramatically. I'm done with this family, done with this manipulation, done with all of it. You can keep your money and your conditions. I'll make it on my own. She stormed toward the door, then turned back for a final dramatic statement. But don't expect me to be around when you finally realize what you've destroyed here. After Sophia left, Vincent and Margaret sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, Vincent spoke in a more subdued tone. "What if we agree to your terms? What happens then?" "Then the trust works exactly as Eleanor designed it," I replied. "It provides support while encouraging better decision-making. Vincent, you could access funds to properly resolve your legal issues and then receive ongoing distributions as you rebuild your career ethically. Margaret, you could get the addiction treatment you need and then have financial security for the rest of your life." Margaret was crying again, but this time it seemed more genuine, less manipulative. "I do need help," she admitted quietly. "I've known that for years, but it's so hard to stop. And every time I try, something stressful happens and I convince myself that just one more time won't hurt." For the first time since I had met her, Margaret seemed to be speaking honestly about her addiction. Vincent was staring at the trust documents, his financial mind clearly working through the implications. "These provisions about ethical business practices," he said finally. "They're not unreasonable. Actually, they might force me to make some changes I should have made years ago." Over the following months, both Margaret and Vincent began working within the trust's framework, though their progress was uneven. Margaret entered a residential treatment program, and for the first time in years, she seemed genuinely committed to recovery. She would call me regularly from the facility, and our conversations began to feel more like actual mother-daughter talks rather than manipulation attempts. "I'm learning so much about myself," she told me during one call. "Not just about the gambling, but about how I've used other people's money as a way to avoid taking responsibility for my own life." Vincent worked with the trust's attorneys to resolve his SEC issues, which ultimately required paying substantial fines but avoided criminal charges. He left his old firm and joined a smaller, more conservative investment company where his practices would be closely monitored. "I hate admitting this," he told me during one of our monthly check-ins, "but having the trust oversight actually makes it easier to say no to risky opportunities. I can blame the trust restrictions instead of admitting I don't trust my own judgment anymore." Sophia, true to her dramatic exit, cut off contact with the entire family for almost a year. But eventually, she reached out to me through social media. Her message was different in tone from her previous communications, less dramatic, more genuine. "Catherine, I've been thinking a lot about what happened at that meeting. I was so angry and hurt, but I've started to realize that maybe you were trying to help, not control. I'm not ready to deal with the whole family situation yet, but I wanted you to know that I'm getting clean and trying to figure out my life without depending on anyone else's money." I was proud of her for taking that step, and I let her know that the trust would be available to support her recovery and legitimate career goals whenever she was ready. The most surprising outcome was how these changes affected my relationship with my adoptive parents. David and Susan Hilton had been worried about my involvement with my biological family from the beginning, afraid that I might be hurt or manipulated. When I explained what had happened with the trust and how my biological family had initially reacted, my adoptive father shook his head grimly. "Catherine, I'm proud of how you handled that situation, but I'm also sorry you had to go through it," he said. "No one should have to choose between being taken advantage of and being seen as the bad guy by people they care about." My adoptive mother added, "You know, your grandmother Eleanor sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She saw your strength and integrity, just like we always have." Their support meant everything to me during those difficult months when I questioned whether I had made the right decisions. 2 years after that confrontational family meeting, the trust was operating exactly as Eleanor had envisioned. Margaret had been sober for 18 months and was working part-time at an addiction counseling center, finding purpose in helping others who struggled with gambling addiction. The trust provided her with a modest but comfortable income, covering her housing, healthcare, and basic needs while she focused on recovery and meaningful work. Vincent had rebuilt his career within ethical guidelines and was actually more successful than he had been before. The forced transparency and accountability had eliminated the stress and legal risks that had plagued his previous work. He was in a stable relationship for the first time in years and had even started talking about wanting children someday. "I never thought I'd say this," he told me during one of our quarterly trust meetings, "but having boundaries around money has actually made me happier. I sleep better at night knowing I'm not constantly gambling with other people's futures." Sophia had eventually rejoined the family, clean and sober, and was making steady progress as an actress. The trust paid for legitimate acting classes and helped her move to Los Angeles properly, with a realistic budget and career plan. She booked her first recurring television role a year after getting clean. I realize now that I was using drugs to deal with the anxiety of never knowing where my next rent payment was coming from, she explained during one of our family dinners. Having the trust there as a safety net, but with real expectations and boundaries, actually gave me the security I needed to focus on my career instead of just surviving day to day. But the most meaningful outcome was something I hadn't expected when Eleanor and I first designed the trust structure. The family began functioning like an actual family for the first time since I had met them. Without the constant stress of financial crisis and the enabling patterns that had defined their relationships for decades, Margaret, Vincent, and Sophia started relating to each other as people rather than as sources of emergency funding or competition for resources. Margaret became a source of wisdom about addiction recovery for both Vincent and Sophia, who had their own struggles with compulsive behaviors around money and substances. Vincent used his financial expertise to help Sophia create realistic budgets and career plans, something he never could have done when he was struggling with his own financial integrity. Sophia brought creativity and emotional intelligence to family interactions, helping everyone communicate more honestly about their needs and feelings. And slowly, tentatively, they began including me not as the trustee who controlled their money, but as their sister and daughter. The first time Margaret called me just to check how I was doing, without mentioning money or the trust, I almost cried. The first time Vincent invited me to dinner with his girlfriend simply because he wanted me to meet someone important to him, I realized that we were finally building the family relationships Eleanor had hoped for. But perhaps the most profound change was in my own relationship with money and success. Building my business had always been about proving something to myself, to my adoptive parents, to the world. I had measured my worth by my financial achievements and my independence. Managing the trust taught me that money could be a tool for helping people grow and heal, not just for building personal wealth or buying security. Eleanor had trusted me with her life's work not because I was financially successful, but because I understood the difference between helping and enabling. This realization led me to make significant changes in my own company. I instituted policies that provided real financial education for employees, not just competitive salaries. I created pathways for advancement that prioritized integrity and long-term thinking over short-term profits. I also began working with other families who were struggling with generational wealth and addiction issues, helping them create trust structures that could break destructive patterns while preserving family relationships. 3 years after Eleanor's death, I established the Eleanor Blackwood Foundation, using a portion of my own business profits to provide resources for families dealing with addiction and financial dysfunction. The foundation offers counseling, financial education, and legal assistance for creating family structures that promote accountability and healing. The most rewarding part of this work is seeing other families discover what mine did, that setting boundaries around money isn't about control or punishment, but about creating space for real relationships to grow. I still serve as trustee for the Blackwood Family Trust, but now it feels less like a burden and more like an honor. Eleanor trusted me to help her family learn lessons she couldn't teach them herself, and watching Margaret, Vincent, and Sophia become the people they were always capable of being has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. Recently, Vincent brought his girlfriend Sarah to meet the family, and during dinner she commented on how close and supportive we all seemed. "We weren't always this way," Margaret said, glancing at me with a smile. "We had to learn how to be a family. It took someone from outside the family dysfunction to help us see what we were doing to each other and to ourselves." "Catherine saved us from ourselves," Sophia added. "Though we definitely didn't see it that way at first." Vincent nodded. "The hardest part was accepting that someone could say no to us and still love us. We were so used to conditional relationships based on financial transactions that we didn't know what unconditional boundaries looked like." Sarah looked around the table with genuine warmth. "Well, whatever you all went through, you came out of it as a really beautiful family." After dinner, as we were cleaning up, Margaret pulled me aside. "Catherine, I need to tell you something that I should have said a long time ago," she said, her voice serious. I braced myself, wondering if some old resentment was about to surface. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for seeing who I could be instead of just who I was. Thank you for caring enough about this family to make the hard decisions. And thank you for giving me the chance to be a real mother to you, even though I didn't earn it." The words hit me harder than I expected. For so many years, I had felt caught between my gratitude to my adoptive parents and my complicated feelings about my biological family. But in that moment, I realized that love didn't have to be limited or competitive. The Hiltons had given me the foundation of security and values that made it possible for me to help the Blackwoods heal. And the Blackwoods had given me the opportunity to use my strengths in service of something larger than my own success. Eleanor had been right when she told me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no. But she had also taught me something even more important, that real family isn't about who gives you money or who never challenges you. It's about who cares enough to help you become the best version of yourself, even when that process is difficult. Today, 4 years after that confrontational family meeting, I'm sitting in my office looking at a photo of Eleanor that sits on my desk next to pictures of my adoptive parents and my biological family. In the photo, Eleanor is smiling, holding a glass of champagne at Vincent's engagement party last month. Vincent and Sarah are planning a wedding for next spring, and they've asked me to officiate since I'm the one who helped bring stability to the family. Margaret is celebrating 3 years of sobriety and has been promoted to supervisor at the addiction counseling center where she works. Sophia just landed a recurring role on a major television series and is using trust funds to buy her first home in Los Angeles. Most importantly, we all talk to each other regularly, not because we need something, but because we choose to be in each other's lives. The trust continues to operate exactly as Eleanor designed it, providing security while maintaining accountability. But now it feels less like a necessary structure and more like a family tradition of thoughtful financial stewardship. I often think about what would have happened if I had given in to their initial demands for money without strings attached. Vincent would likely be in prison for securities fraud. Margaret would probably have gambled away hundreds of thousands of dollars and still be trapped in her addiction. Sophia might have overdosed or fallen victim to one of the many scams targeting vulnerable people in the entertainment industry. Instead, they're all building meaningful lives based on their own efforts and strengths, with the trust providing support and security rather than enabling dysfunction. The business lessons I learned from managing the trust have made me a better CEO as well. I've learned to distinguish between helping employees grow and simply making their lives easier in ways that don't actually serve them long term. I've learned that sometimes the most supportive thing you can do for someone is to let them experience the natural consequences of their choices while providing resources for them to learn and improve. Most importantly, I've learned that money is just a tool. It can be used to build people up or tear them down, to create dependency or independence, to heal families or destroy them. The difference isn't in the amount of money, but in the wisdom and intention behind how it's used. Eleanor understood this when she created the trust. She could have simply divided her money equally among her children and grandchildren, but she knew that would have been the easy choice, not the right choice. By putting the money in a structure that required her family to grow and heal in order to benefit from it, she gave them something much more valuable than wealth. She gave them the opportunity to become the people they were always capable of being. If you're watching this and you're struggling with family members who only seem to value you for what you can provide financially, know that setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's necessary. If you're dealing with your own struggles around money and responsibility, know that change is possible, but it requires facing difficult truths about patterns and behaviors that might feel comfortable but aren't serving you. And if you're in a position where you have the opportunity to help family members but you're not sure how to do it in a way that actually helps rather than enables, consider that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is create structure and expectations rather than just providing resources. Eleanor once told me, "Catherine, money reveals character, but it doesn't create it." The goal isn't to control people with money, but to create conditions where they can develop the character that will serve them long after the money is gone. That wisdom has guided every decision I've made as trustee, every policy I've implemented in my business, and every relationship I've built since then. Family isn't about who shares your DNA or who adopted you or who has access to your bank account. Family is about who shows up consistently, who supports your growth even when it's inconvenient, and who cares enough about your long-term well-being to sometimes tell you things you don't want to hear. The Blackwood Family Trust taught us all how to be family to each other. And Eleanor, wherever she is, would be proud of what we've built together. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members around money? What helped you stay strong in your decision? What would you do if you discovered your biological family only wanted your financial support? Share your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to support more content like this. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect yourself and your resources, even from family. Remember, as Eleanor taught me, your worth isn't measured by what you give to those who take, but by the wisdom and integrity you bring to every relationship in your life. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no.